Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last Transmedia Art Seminar of this year. We thank Mahindra Humanities Center and MetaLab for sponsoring this series this year. We are very excited today to welcome Caroline Jones of our architecture department at MIT, who will be talking about metaverse and the definition of transmedia. Caroline is a well-known curator and art historian who have had exhibitions and curations at many museums around the world. And she's also an author of numerous books, including the last one, The Global Work of Art. And for those of you who want to learn more about Caroline, here is the link to her bio. And today we are thrilled to welcome her and to learn what's the mysterious metaverse that everybody's talking about, and you know what's potential for art curation and for transmedia metaverse universe might bring. So I'm going to tune out right now and get off the video. And
should I then go ahead and screen share? Are we ready for that?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. Let's get right into it. Well, clearly, I'm not going to be able to answer everyone's questions about the metaverse, but that buzzword will come in at the end of my talk if we get there, but I'm happy to zoom ahead and look at some of the intriguing marketing images that are starting to come out. So to begin with, I wanted to thank Magda for reaching out to me. It was so cool to find out that this seminar existed, and you know, I'm really honored to be here. I'm here to learn from the people who are the regulars in this seminar, because for me, transmedia is very much an open question, and I'm sharing those questions with you tonight. I also want to thank my research assistant on this project when it was first starting, who is Walker Downey, who recently defended a brilliant dissertation here at MIT, and I saw that Walker's on this webinar, so I'm super excited to see him there, and he will recognize his research in the architecture of this talk. I finally want to thank the research director of the Transmedia Storytelling Initiative at MIT, who is Chari Zaman, and I'll be telling you a little bit about him and his path to the work that we do together over here at MIT. So I'm going to start out just by showing you in that Germanic way, that academic way, the structure of my talk tonight. Defining transmedia. This was a problem I presented to myself. Ending up in a School of Architecture and Planning. This initiative is obviously about spatialized productions, and I'll be asking about that, which has direct bearing on how the metaverse is being ideologically constructed. And then finally, I'm hoping we will get to an NEH Digital Humanities project that we were able to, a grant that we were able to get for a latent archive being extracted with machine learning and a little bit of AI from existing archival cinema. So that's kind of an exciting project underway that I'm hoping I'll have time to share with you tonight. But since I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, I'm going to zip on ahead. All right, so defining transmedia, first of all, is a situated proposition, right? I'm obviously giving you an East Coast perspective. Transmedia has been divided into some camps by some scholars that I'll be talking about. But more than that, I'm going to give you an MIT-centric perspective, right? So it's a perspective centered on design, hacking, engineering, being inside the code, right? Less likely to come from narrative forms. And that's part of how I want to frame that, okay? So in defining it, I'm going to take a path through what I take to be the readerly and then the writerly and then the spatialized histories of this term. There's a rough historical order to this, but obviously they overlap consistently over the decades in question. So I'm not going to read all these words, but you know, I'm going to hope that you can multitask in the way of transmediators, okay? Basically, the starting point for this term is Marcia Kinder, who's bringing it out of multi-platform commerce, but specifically as a kind of a film scholar reflecting on the impact on children. I'll be talking about that. It's a term that's taken up by artists and by media theorists at the turn of the millennium. And my former colleague at MIT, Henry Jenkins, takes a very powerful position in defining and kind of claiming transmedia for himself around, I mean, you can just read this, multiple delivery channels, coordinated entertainment experience. I mean, this is the language of industry, and Henry was kind of responding to product. And that's something I would argue with him about, okay? By the time I step into this story with graduate students and amazing makers and researchers, right, we're dealing with born digital makers and thinkers. And I want to emphasize the blending of fiction and nonfiction, right? Jenkins didn't really have a space for nonfiction, but many of the makers that I'm encountering are making powerful use of these forms for documentary purposes. Okay, so Marcia Kinder comes up with this term, transmedia intertextuality. She's not the first to use the word transmedia, but she's the first to bring it into a humanities and academic discourse. Her major book is this Playing with Power, with, crappy pixelated image, sorry about that. But it works in her argument to position consumers as powerful players, disavowing commercial manipulation. Now, there are a lot of ethical claims smuggled into this that I want to surface. The agency of the consumer is not passive. And by the way, these consumers she's looking at are children. And the image here is a grainy, pixelated, rendering from a documentary film that was made about her book. And what we're seeing here is young game players on a console on the Santa Monica Pier, right? Playing a commercial video game and becoming these kinds of active intertextuality, transmediators that Kinder is theorizing. All right, so drawing on Walker Downey's careful reading, right? Marcia Kinder is using post-structural theorists like Kristeva and early modernists like Bakhtin to look at intertextuality and the dialogic, in the lives of children, right? And she's obviously pulling on psychologists like Piaget and so on. I think we can situate Kinder within a larger shift in the traditional humanities, a cultural studies turn towards Rezeptionsgeschichte, right? Looking at those who are receiving culture, not as passive recipients, but as active makers of meaning. So in this account, per Downey, transmedia storytelling demands acts of recognition, distinction, and combination by these young users. And I guess what I would say is that this is, above all, a readerly argument, right? This is a post-structural reader in the text that gives agency to the people consuming culture, but it is not about people making that culture, right? This is not a maker's perspective. This is a readerly perspective about meaning making in that kind of post-structural cultural turn. Okay, so then what we have is an argument about children. And these are some presumably photoshopped images just grabbed off the web, right? Of a tiny baby having his first lightsaber fight. Kinder, by focusing on children, she necessarily enters a moral conversation on the development of the mind. And, I would draw on the work of media theorist Sasha Costanza-Chock, whose book, Transmedia Organizing, right, is a highly political reading of this domain of discourse. And Sasha talks about Kinder as being a social analysis of gender normative games and toys cross-marketed by industry in a newly relaxed regulatory environment. I mean, that's pretty damning, but that is the broad brush in which I paint Kinder and Jenkins. They are, for my part, as an East Coast person, far too West Coast identified, far too industry identified. Now, Jenkins, not coincidentally, left MIT for a position at USC, where Jenkins is, 300 yards from the industry in his own school. At his time at MIT, around the turn of the millennium, Jenkins brings Kinder's transmedia to adults and into digital convergence. And Jenkins is obviously has no interest in children except for the childlike play of adults, creating story worlds out of their fan relationship. You can see two of his many, many books here. The active readers mode continues, and he describes the users of these franchised cross-platform operations as textual poachers, active harvesters. I remembered this moment when I was still, coming out of grad school in the 90s, where we were interested in queer fanzines for Star Trek and things like that. Jenkins does not get into the non-normative. For him, again, as with Kinder, this is normative gender regulatory play. And again, it furthers this readerly perspective. Now, as examined by literary culture and film studies, we have this kind of bibliography. Narratology gets into the act, storytelling comes into the act, and with Christy Dina, the first PhD, as Walker identified it, of transmedia, heft, is about practice and making, writing and making of transmedia. Andrea Phillips has made this, very important distinction between East Coast and West Coast modalities. And Jeff Long, who came out of MIT's Comparative Media Studies program and is now on the West Coast, is very much a West Coast identified Jenkins, product. So here we go. Just to remind you what Phillips terms the East Coast project is essentially transfictional or cross-medial, using Dina's terms. The dispersion of these media products are not to increase consumption of the commercial product, but to challenge readers and viewers. So I would completely buy into this description. This is Walker Downey's summary of Phillips and Dina's articulation of the East Coast. And, I consider it a kind of McLuhan's length distance from the industry that is incredibly powerful if we can theorize it and use it to our advantage, to allow criticality to bloom and to continue. All right. Hypertext is important to our understanding of this intertextual turn. I also point out transmedia machines that are being designed in computer science. And because we're art historian types, we want to see the Fluxus project by Dick Higgins of intermedia coming into this story, okay? But these are all 60s to 70s to early 80s kinds of notions. And we probably have to dismiss Higgins when we're talking about this new digital convergence moment recognized in the 1988 computer science paper about a transmedia machine. Right? This is like a Turing machine. It's a hypothetical entity that takes images that are read, images that are printed, image data, code data, right? And it puts it all in a black box and it produces transmedia, right? So I'm interested in those imaginaries as well and those trajectories as well, because at MIT, I live in that, very much in that penumbra. All right, so what is the writerly? Downey introduced this in his research by looking at, computer art and the algorists, but I want to introduce yet another literary turn, which is Janet Murray's Hamlet on the Holodeck, which is a real monument of the literary theoretical approach to transmedia. And interestingly, there's a spatial imaginary already in germ, right? The holodeck is a spatial imaginary, right? These images of, Star Trek and the holodeck, right, are very much the fantasy of converting textual narrative, Hamlet, which might be taking place in a spatial frame called a stage or a theater. I'm hoping you guys will pick up on that and help me think about that. And it's being imagined here in a digital universe that is insistently spatialized. And that imaginary that we see on the bottom right, that is an architectural imaginary. That kind of wireframe thinking is coming out of architecture schools, notably the one I'm sitting in right now. So Walker comes at it from an art history perspective, which I adore. And, there, elements like this fascinating Eastern European, like the algorists is a kind of an interesting moment where the writerly engages with code in order to produce visual objects, right? So that's a turn that interests us. And the dates of these landmarks are all very, very close, right? The Janet Murray is 97. The Roman Verostko is 98. And then, of course, we have Hollywood's own rejoinder, which is The Matrix. So by 1999, you have this imaginary of the code as a almost physical material building an inhabitable world. And I'll just, move to the next slide because this GIF is very greedy. I think that impulse has a fascinating effect, which is that the artists who enter this world of code actually want to subtract code, right? They do not want to build Neo's world. They do not want to drain energy from meat machines to power a fully virtual matrix. They actually want to subtract things from the matrix in order to make us aware of a sort of spatial vacuum that these virtual worlds have placed us into. So this is, of course, Cory Arcangel's wonderful Super Mario Clouds, where the fun little video game is depleted of its main actors and of its narrative. And what we see are the kind of Roy Lichtenstein-like pop art cloud forms, moving through this Cerulean space. This impulse to subtract, by hacking into the code to subtract and reveal kinds of governing norms and abstractions, is very evident in the contemporary artist Rachel Rawson and her work with single vantage point shooter games, which she occupies in a kind of wonderfully queer way. I can't get into too many details or I will just derail this talk entirely, but here's another GIF of her tweaking of the code of honor, where she just removes the shooters and so on, and we're just given explosions that we can move in and out of and back and forth on, so that our body's movements in the virtual reality control the movement of space-time, which I'll come back to. I think that's a super interesting intervention on the part of Rachel Rawson. This imaginary of inhabiting code, if Rachel Rawson and Cory Arcangel are kind of the digital pastoral, the transmedia pastoral, then we might think of Ryoji Ikeda as the transmedia sublime, right? An absolutely sublime surround of pure code, pure data, numbers flashing, data bits flashing, right? And it's interesting that Ikeda comes out of a computer music world in Japan. It's part of the group Dumb Type. And so the musicians' view of infinity, view of data bits as surrounding mathematical worlds, I think is salient to Ikeda's work. All right, so where are we? If this is the writerly, where the artistic and the creative enters the code to produce what end up being kind of spatialized commentaries on this emerging metaverse, this emerging digital universe, then, I want to hone in on the spatial as a specific focus. If where I'm sitting, I'm going to be obsessed by the spatial, it also comes with it, brings with it a kind of an in-betweenness, right? An in-between function in terms of the readerly and the writerly. And here our touch points might be Gene Youngblood's Expanded Cinema, which was just released again. This is an art world talismanic text, not necessarily one in film theory at all. Dick Higgins' early intervention around that idea of intermedia. Lars Ellerstrom, multimodality, intermediality. My own colleague here, William Mauricio, on the algorithmic turn, and our colleague Gloria Sutton's recent work on Stan Vanderbeek. And this idea of expanded cinema turns out to have legs, turns out to be important to the art world because it intersects so much with genres like installation art, with attributes like immersion, that we're trying to understand and that we're kind of arguing about. So Michelle Kuo is coming in a week or so to talk about and against immersion. Gloria Sutton's next book is sort of against immersion. So, you know, we can talk in the Q&A about who's afraid of immersion and why. Stan Vanderbeek is obviously a touch point here with his, you know, Cinemadrome. I think this spatialized turn is inevitable. And here I want to kind of surface one of the qualities of research in this Transmedia Storytelling Initiative, which is around what are the affordances of human perception that space encodes, right? And Kossuth's wonderful 3 chairs is a great example, because we have the representation, we have the concept of the chair, and then we have the spatialized chair, right? The chairiness of the chair in space calls to us as agents of actions. We want to sit on it, we want to fold it up, we want to move it around as furniture, we want to command and control the chair, right? So going spatial brings with it certain affordances of agency on the part of the viewer. We don't want to be dragged around a virtual space willy-nilly, right? It implies and, you know, and somehow promises interactivity. And that's something I want to kind of hold on to and bring forward and see what that means. MIT obviously has a fetish for interactivity, specifically coming out of my current department, which had a little split somewhere in the late 70s between architects who wanted to work with materials and hammer them together, and architects who founded the Architecture Machine Group, which went into what became the Media Lab, right? So you begin with a desire for touchscreen manipulations, a very important phase of human user interface, you know? And then by 85, that same research had ended up with a kind of military console command and control center, right? A kind of Playboy Hugh Hefner bed, right? Where everything is controlled from, you know, the man's vantage point, right? This is a actual documented archival trajectory in which the Media Lab goes from being imagined as a kind of social space of flying kites and having barbecues to being a cockpit for researchers commanding individual labs. More about that later if you're interested. Okay, in my research, I get interested by the curious fate of kinetic sculpture, right? So if Janet Murray's aesthetic categories in Hamlet on the holodeck are immersion, agency, and transformation, I want to do a prehistory of that goes back to these clunky, fabulous, responsive kinetic art objects. And what we're looking at here is a sketch by Edward Donatowicz of his Sennster from 1970, okay? And I've used a fancy idea from Gilbert Simondon, technophanie, the idea that technology has an immanence to us when it responds to our actions. When there is an intuitive interface with technology, there's a kind of technophany. And I've used that idea to argue for Sennster as a very important moment in training us as users, as visitors to spaces of culture and science and exploratoria and, you know, like art museums, to enter technological worlds, to enter completely submersive and immersive technological worlds that respond to us, right? So no one would look at this as media. So my argument is really about the subject position, right? I'm arguing for this kind of technophanic moment where the Sennster discovers us to be present to it, and we discover it to have agency in response to our presence. And the most famous and beloved story about this is when Donatowicz achieves, you know, plugs in the last piece and is startled when the Sennster comes quietly around to stare into his face because he has coughed, right? So he has his own kind of shiver of uncanny imminence to this technological responsiveness. And I think these moments are important. Love the babes too. Gotta love the babes. The second person I examine in this piece I wrote about this sort of pre-computer technological immersiveness is Wenying Tsai, a Chinese-born engineer who left his job at, I don't know, IBM or something, and comes on over into the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT to make these responsive kinetic objects that are described by those who experience them as almost like aquatic sea creatures, anemones, right, that respond to sound and movement by the humans that come into their oceanic realm. So when Janet Murray says we will need a coherent set of conventions for signaling interactors, right, in the holodeck, I'm imagining this as that moment. This is establishing the conventions for determining our intuitive interactions with the machinic phyla. This is my claim. Happy to argue with you about it. So with that as a kind of backdrop, I want to basically conclude this introduction by saying transmedia are plural, right? They have many trajectories out of literature, out of architecture, out of film studies, right? They have these writerly modes, readerly modes, and then in my argument, this kind of spatialized technophony that trains us to inhabit what will become virtual environments, virtual realities, virtual universes. Okay, so now the incredibly parochial history of my own little transmedia storytelling initiative. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Not too bad. So you can read here, the emerging arguments and justifications for this little unit, right? I wanted it to be completely porous. I wanted it to be an open question. What is transmedia? I wanted it to offer sponsorship to various experiments to see what would stick, right? What would endure. And one of the things that we did was obviously support curriculum that could grow this conversation. The footnote here is to a very important collaborator with our group, who is Deniz Tortum, a Turkish and Philadelphia-based artist filmmaker who is fascinated by, in a kind of Lev Manovich mode, the futures that are embedded in the past, right? The affordances and experiments from the past that we need to look into in order to have more creative possibilities in the future that will not be entirely determined by capitalism and monetization. Okay, so the bottom one will be important to any conversation we might have about the metaverse, because the metaverse was being discussed long before Meta, branded itself with an infinity sign. We want this domain to remain a space of play in addition to being whatever monetized platforms it's going to be, right? We want academia to remain a spot where there can be critical resistance to the monetization of everything. So, a bit of history. It surprises a lot of people to learn that there was a very significant film program at MIT. The filmmaker Ricky Leacock had been brought in the late 60s, and his first job by President Jerome Wiesner was to document the student unrest. Very interesting guy, very interesting tenure at MIT. There's an argument to be made, although MIT remembers nothing about its alumni, there's an argument to be made that the alumni of this program go out to seed the documentary renaissance in the US and in Europe. After Leacock's retirement, his protege, Gloriana Davenport, began the Interactive Cinema Group at the Media Lab, and that lasted till 2004. Meanwhile, the Comparative Media Studies program got going, and that's where Henry Jenkins was pushing hard on the question of transmedia. This initiative was founded in 2019, and really it opens with this question to which I return. What is transmedia? Now, I knew from my colleagues in literature and in comparative media studies that this thing, transmedia storytelling, was like an idea. But what I learned after naming this initiative after that was that it had been declared dead as a term by no less than Andrea Phillips. no accident that the buzzword transmedia started to wane just as the escape room was becoming a party thing and a corporate thing, right? These computerized rooms that are programmed to present you with puzzles, and you're kind of inside Tron. You're inside Tron and you have to get out of there in order to get your cocktail. Anyway, I thought, okay, that's wonderful. Transmedia is dead. It's open for us to reinvent it. And I had, great conversations with people like Sasha Costanza-Chock about how we might want to do that now that transmedia is dead. Okay, so the first thing I did was, argue that I'm not going to make an org chart. I'm making an ecosystem. This is almost like a fish tank of history. On the left, you could say, are the more humanities, literature, film studies based groups, anthropology, sociology, things like that are happening over there. In the middle is the sort of makers of the art program, ACT, the visual art program of the 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the film section that kind of got all this going. And then on the right are weird entities like the Nano Immersion Lab here at MIT, the giant foundation of the Media Lab, and the early history of the Center for Advanced Visual Studies. And down there below 1970 is, of course, weird eccentrics like Doc Edgerton, who brought stroboscopic photography from Europe in the 20s to MIT and did, the exploding Apple bullet thing and all that, right? So this ecosystem offered various historical trajectories, and I wanted to see how that would all go. These are the actual logos of some of these entities. MIT is a sea of acronyms, and essentially my own unit. I don't know if you can see my mouse moving, but the tiniest little unit here of all is history and theory and criticism. And yet our little position inside the Department of Architecture turns out to be very branché. It is very networked to these other larger entities. The collaborators who stepped up to get the curriculum grants included artists, urban planners, Shadi Zaman, whom I've already mentioned, who is trained in design and computation, Fox Harrell, who's a fantastic theorist of phantasmal media, Jeannie Brinkema, who's an amazing film scholar, right? So I was able to entertain collaborations across all these groups, and it made me very happy to do so. So Chade is probably the single most important of my collaborators. He graduated from the design and computation group with a PhD, is passionately committed to architecture as a discipline that allows multiple kinds of experiments. And in his own work, he's deeply, deeply engaged with using media platforms for disability rights, disability studies, right? So he actually has a company called Mediate, which is pioneering cell phone programs in which vision is converted to sound instructions about what's in a space that you're encountering, and so on and so forth, what street corner you're on, all of that kind of stuff. So he's a very cool guy, and I adore collaborating with him. So the first courses, I'm going to zip through these. The day I announced this, my colleague Rafi Segal was in my office saying, we really need to do a course on, extraction and urbanism and locations. And he collaborated with the artists Marisa Moranyan, and they did this, Minds and others. The syllabus, how might creative transmedia stories play a key role in deepening and shaping the public imaginary around extraction. So this very first semester, a particular student collaboration resulted, and I would like to take a few moments to play this little transmedia piece of art. Tell me in the chat if you can't hear it.
read the news today, oh boy, about a lucky man made a race. And though the news was rather sad, but I just had to laugh. I saw the photograph. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. Crowd of people stood and stared. Seen his face before. Nobody was really sure he was on the house floor. I saw a film today, oh boy. The English army that just won the war. Crowd of people turned away. I just had to look. Having read
So this was a pretty good proof of concept. That little cell phone video made it into a COVID time biennial, virtual biennial in a Manhattan art gallery. So we were pretty pumped about that. We've since had to, she's since had to actually commission a musician to do the music because of course you can't really use the Beatles for anything. Hopefully it'll be considered fair use when this recording goes live. So Catherine is an architecture student and Carolyn is an anthropologist. And the two of them came together to make this rather charming, tiny little transmedia thing. But of course, despite Catherine's being an architect, this is linear and happening on a flat screen. So how could we get to that capacious metaverse that everyone was beginning to talk about? Two other classes came about, and I would like to emphasize Shadi Zaman's collaboration with Fox Harrell, the author of Phantasmal Media, literally just kind of naming the problem, virtuality and presence. And I teased Shadi a little bit about using a work of installation art, Olafur Eliasson's Beauty, on the poster. But that's where architecture enters the art world, through artists that embrace spatialized, immersive installation art. All right, so I did my own media theory class with the fantastic film theorist Eugenie Brinkema. These are subjects that are now permanent in the curriculum, so that's really exciting. And it's just a moving target, right? We're trying to figure out new kind of modes of media as they come along. My dean, made this nice sketch of the fantasy. Once the donation came in, we'd have 3 years of this donation to bring it up to this incredible logarithmic increase, but a different logarithm came to town, which was, of course, the coronavirus. Well, that kind of threw a wrench in things. But who better positioned to kind of try to figure that out than this team struggling with virtuality? So I'm showing you here a work that came out of the workshop on virtuality and presence with Fox Harrell, a fantastic collaboration between 4 different trajectories: a computer scientist, an architect, a student in the graduate art program, and an urban studies person, okay? And what I'm going to do here is click ahead to 4 minutes in, if I can do that. And what you'll see is a room, basically, that is the home apartment of the COVID quarantined makers, right? And what they've done is insert into the augmented reality, using the Oculus Quest headsets, they've inserted media objects from vernacular videos taken on the street. And I found this piece incredibly impressive because I was experiencing normative journalism telling me, oh, the street protests are violent, there's destruction, right? There's looting. I mean, this is a traditional media take on street protests. And when they found these vernacular media and brought them together, what I felt was happening was it was domesticated, it was in our world, and it was incredibly moving. The joy, the exuberance, the dancing, and the truth that was being spoken on the street. So this personalization of journalism, this spatialization and making intimate of street videos was, I thought, very profound. And I'm happy to talk more about this group and about the work they did together. So you navigate in the VR with these pointers that then activate the media objects. I think that's probably enough, but it's a very powerful piece. Just trying to get to the next. Okay, so COVID and virtuality. All of us on this Zoom doubtless learned how much we missed the in-person teamwork. But surprisingly, to do work on virtuality, you need actual access to physical tools. So shipping Oculus to headsets around became a necessary component, but we also learned how much can be assembled by trading digital files, breaking into small pedagogical units, Zoom rooms, and breaking up the tasks and compiling things over time in massive cloud sharing platforms. Our own group pivoted to 100% webcast and streaming for events. And I was talking to Magda about this earlier. We went from having 100 people in a room max to having, 4,000 people coming to our events. It was pretty amazing. And we directed funds away from curriculum development and public programming towards actually just giving money to students who were having all the well-studied problems getting jobs and finding internships and going to archives and doing whatever students need to do. So, these are some of the projects that received student funding. I'm not going to go into detail. These were some of the events that we did. Data Magic and Democracy was postponed due to COVID, and we ended up doing it a few days before the election, which was kind of remarkable. 3D 5G was anticipating the convergence of these two very powerful technologies. Maybe this group knows it, maybe they don't, but 5G networks are coming, and that allows the real-time processing of drone surveillance data. Okay, so that's just something we wanted to talk about. And the founding donation expires July 1 of this year. So this is a good time to be asking about the future. And I think I will just zip ahead and say that we had these two capstone events last fall because we knew this was the final year. And, the spoiler alert is we got this NEH grant and hoping I make it to that. We had physical and hybrid events in both, which were obviously expensive, right? You do a symposium and then you webcast it, it's twice as much. You do an exhibition and you make a virtual exhibition, it's twice as much. So this was the exhibition. It's always wonderful to be in an architecture school because you have fantastically talented alums, and they built this out of postal tubes. Here's the VR Nook with Shadi and Denise beta testing the helmets, wearing their masks. And here's a carefully unmasked moment with me and one of the two donors, Nina Fialco. you know, we had these categories, right? There were cozy spaces where you looked at the intimate pieces like the cell phone video. There were wall works where we felt they could hold the wall and could, you know, really immerse you in their basically film field of vision. We had 2 VR works. We had installations. We had a plasma screen outside in which code ate itself before the viewer's eyes. And we have a virtual link to that exhibition. So maybe I'll put that in the chat later, but in any case, if you want, you can navigate over to this URL and actually explore the works as media objects inside a virtual exhibition designed by the exhibition designers. And these are just some images. You know, the work on the far right was transmedia, including, you know, the smell of cat pheromones and imagery of, you know, toxoplasmosis critters in our bloodstream by Ray Ping Su, you know, and I can go on forever about any one of these works. One of my favorites was Yara Jacobi's split screen video in which the real world of her quarantine apartment with her partner became a kind of schizophrenic double world of her virtual, you know, photogrammetry rendering of her living space. I found it a quite beautiful meditation on the quarantine. And you see that the title is actually A Year of COVID. All right, so the symposium that we did, I'm gonna zoom through this. We split it into 3 parts, looking at architecture, simulation, and cinema through virtual life engines, through space-time, and a plenary address. And the prompts for this were the rapidly evolving capacities of making completely fake humans. The work on the left is a very important one that was produced by Fran Panetta and Halsey Berglund in Fox Harrell's Center for Advanced Virtuality. In the event of moon disaster, animating a speech that Richard Nixon never gave with an actor morphed into Richard Nixon with complex, you know, voice synthetic software and face synthetic software. Unreal Engine launched its MetaHuman at around this time, and we were very engaged with how we would address that in a kind of critical, academic, scholarly way. And we wanted to make the point that history is full of metahumans, right? Méliès' Voyage to the Moon has a metahuman, and film history is full of tricks that make fake people do fake things. So space-time was the second of the 2, and there again, Méliès, a still from you know, his thing. One of the prompts was the reality of virtual production accelerated by COVID, where you have a fully digital stage set surround in which the cast of The Mandalorian can be real actors, right? There's no more green screen. There's no more Georges Méliès, you know, compositing of separately shot images, right? You have real actors in real time acting within a digital surround made by high resolution LED screens. So this is the set of The Mandalorian. But again, we wanted to go back into cinematic history with the middle term being Douglas Trumbull's special effects, and he became our plenary, specifically the curious architectural history by which an urbanist trained in city planning and working on city models becomes an assistant to Trumbull, who's the founding image maker of Industrial Light and Magic for Star Wars franchise, right? So you have this interesting wormhole of the spatial computational engineers imagining cities and city spaces in the computational environment, literally creating the story worlds of our fictional space-time future. It was an incredible honor to meet Trumbull and have him physically present for this event. And we felt very privileged and very humbled by the fact that he was struggling with his ultimately fatal disease that he died of a few months later. So this was a very important moment for us in November. And I just want to, I don't know, dedicate this lecture to Doug. He was an incredible inspiration for all of us. And we felt very, very lucky to be able to meet him and interact with him while he was here. The space-time discussion group included that artist, Rachel Rawson, whom I mentioned earlier, who makes the bridge between the virtual world of painting, right, and the virtual world of gaming. And my favorite hacks of hers, you know, as I mentioned earlier, take Call of Duty and subtract the guns and subtract the shooter, and we're just left with kind of like weird and creepy villains floating around in sublime landscapes. Virtual life engines, we invited Ian Chang, whose sensational Life After Bob thing was at the Shed at that moment, and his animators and producers and you know, script writers were all there on that session, entirely virtual. So this hybrid, you know, real and virtual symposium, that was another exciting opportunity. I don't know how many of you know about Life of Bob, but it's an effort to make this multi-platform thing all happen at once. So you have a film that you can sit and watch. You have an interactive universe that you can go into and encounter the father and the daughter in which he's implanted an AI, you know, kitty minder, tutor, trainer, right? And this was all based on Ian Chang's inspiration from Stephen King, who made The Shining when he knew he was going to be a father. And he said, well, I'm a little scared about being a father. What's the worst father I could be? So he made you know, he wrote The Shining. So this is Ian Chang's response to that same dilemma. Okay, here's the team. And we could just end here before we get to the NEH grant. And it's 6 o'clock. So Magda, why don't you unmute yourself and tell me what you'd like to do? Should I take 2 minutes and just talk about the NEH project?
Yeah, sure. Why don't, I mean, you know, we still have time, you know.
Yeah, okay. So these are images that are now coming out about the metaverse, right? And I think it's quite interesting from a feminist analytic standpoint that they're women, they're wearing products, and, you know, they're tethered to the supplier of the imagery, right? So I think these anxious graphic designers who are trying to visualize the metaverse are already giving us some gendered tropes that are familiar from histories of technology. New technologies come out, they're always scary, and therefore they're always female, right? So we can talk about that. The perspectives I would offer on the metaverse is that, as in the early writings of Marcia Kinder and Janet Murray, we want to be extremely cautious about the claims for this new immersive environment. Culture works best when it frames its actions as cultural. So Janet Murray was already concerned about, like, we need to make conventions for this holodeck I'm imagining. We need to be able to know that it's not real, because that is the function of culture, to be a kind of a liminal space where we can willingly decide to imagine it as real, but always knowing in a non-psychotic way that it's not real, right? That's where estrangement comes in. That's where the power of critique has to happen. So ideologically, I would say the claiming of the metaverse by Facebook is, you know, related to the cloud and other ideological formations that we need to question. So for our part, we've decided that the most interesting place of research for a transmedia storytelling initiative is precisely on the interface between space and time, particularly in the realm of archival historic cinema. So this grant that we've recently gotten is called the Latent Archive, and it attempts to take digitized cinema and extract spatial information from the parallax between two different frames, right? You have a lot of frames, and you can extract a lot of spatial data from this temporal sequence, right? From this temporal succession. So Chade Zaman, you know, is the man doing this, right? I'm the explainer, I'm the theorizer, I'm the like, oh, let's pick this media object, right? But Chade is looking at a film like Alain Rougrier's L'Immortel, which is entirely set within a single mansion in Turkey, in Istanbul, probably on the Bosphorus. And he's looking at all the operations he can do computationally on this digitized imagery. So for example, he can reconstruct the villa from these varieties of views, and he can examine, where the filmmaker is placing actors and whether there are psychological patterns to where he is placing the actors and so on and so forth. Now, this is the work that traditional film theorists do. I think what is interesting about what Shadi's coming up with is that it has tremendous creative potential, right? So these can be dimensionalized in VR settings. They can become AR, right? The actors can be extrapolated into your creative AR environment, right? So there are lots of possibilities here. The NEH is obviously interested if we can give humanists a new tool. I wonder if we can, because film theorists are pretty awesome as a tribe. I don't know if they need machines to tell them about camera angles, right? But you could potentially have comparative analyses across a vast corpus and come up with, hey, Turkish camera angles are different than Alain Robrier's camera angles, right? You can come up with, vast corpus of data that could allow comparative judgments. Finally, Shadi is playing with the ancient and quite local Oliver Wendell Holmes patented a stereoscope, right? The ancient, for us, the modern history of the stereoscope, he's extracting binocular information from our love object, which is Manhattan. This is where we're obsessing with making our prototype. And he's providing tools from which you can actually look at these binocular separated images. And it provides an interesting alteration of the stereoscopic history. I'm sure you've experienced stereoscopes, and there's always a kind of beautiful flatness to the planes of the image of that still photograph. With the moving image, you get a very robust spatial information to the human perceptual system. You do not feel the planes of separated visual objects. You feel a virtual world. So that's kind of exciting and fun, and stay tuned. Thank you for listening.
So thank you so much, Caroline. It was brilliant. Much appreciated. This particular the overview of the transmedia history, the hidden history of transmedia at MIT. That was extremely interesting, at least to me to hear. I come to this area from completely different discipline, from theater.
Yes.
And there is quite a lot of interesting developments that have been happening in theater for the last 10 years. My first transmedia theater class I taught in 2016 at Yale, and there were like 3 students. Those students went off to do shows which got like millions participants and was Pulitzer nominated and all of those things. But it was not a popular term or understood term within the field of theater, even though this shift that you're talking about, the narrative shift towards spatial spatial storytelling has been happening in theater for quite some time with the immersive theater, and which got its origins from a video game. So we have a shift from a plot-based dramaturgy towards space-based dramaturgy, the kind of dramaturgical architectonics. So instead of exposition at the beginning of the play or at the beginning of the show, you have a room full of items and objects about a particular character history. And by entering the space, the participants can learn this particular character and their past and build a narrative from there. And through space, through spatial environment, you are able to build narrative, and also by moving through different spaces. So this shift has been happening in theater for some time in immersive theater. And now, because of the pandemic, there has been an incredible acceleration of those experiments. And we have, the next kind of a big thing is what people call hybrid theater, and what I like to call transmedia theater, which is happening in kind of a 3 dimensions in both live context and in some sort of platform-based digital-based environment. Actually, we are this weekend we are doing a conference with Freie University in Berlin on a hybrid theater. So I invite everybody who wants to participate. There is a couple of lectures on Zoom, and people can join in. Go to MetaLab website and go to events, and it's our the Weiler Theater Conference with a bunch of different panels, and theater artists and theater theorists have been trying pretty hard to think about the new vocabulary. To how do you think about this emerging art form? Is it theater? Is it film? Is it video game? Like, what is it? And there is really no a good vocabulary from theater, and the one from film does not really apply, and the one from game, from video games does not really apply. So there is quite a struggle, and the thing kind of pandemic accelerated development of an art form for which theorists and artists were not quite prepared. And the big questions that we have in our field is what are plays and projects which are adaptations of old works towards new environments. So like, adapting Shakespeare into transmedia environment, like the Royal Shakespeare Company has done a couple of times pretty successfully, or creating works which are native to that sort of new hybrid transmedia storytelling and narrative building. And that's a little bit more trickier because you actually have to utilize the kind of a native environment of that fluid movement between different media, between live and digital environments. But there have been a couple of quite successful works in, I would say, last 2-3 years, which have managed to accomplish a fairly smooth integration. So it's been a very, very interesting thing, to me to see how this has been approached from visual arts and from computer science and seeing how theater fits into it. And very interesting that all of these disciplines are doing quite similar things and quite similar theoretical approaches. They have quite similar theoretical approaches, but there isn't much movement and language and collaboration between those disciplines. So,
well, I think maybe at MIT there might be, right? So Jay Scheib, I'm very familiar with what he's up to. He's collaborating with my colleague Todd Mack over at the Media Lab. So at least we're trying, but I'm very struck by your identification of a problem that you don't have the vocabulary for this. That's very interesting to me. Is this something that you are working on? I mean, is this a vocabulary and a theorization that you want to offer? Is this?
Well, I think there is a sort of rethinking of the field. The last kind of a big theoretical shift that theater studies did was with the post-dramatic turn,
Yes.
and sort of going from Aristotelian narrative to Brechtian and to post-dramatic narrative. And now we have this transmedial turn, and not all of the definitions that have been previously used and applied to even post-dramatic theater really work in this new environment. I mean, even the way that people, work with those tools, like on Zoom, how do you stage things on Zoom? You use terminology that is applicable to stage. But it's not really applicable to Zoom. Like, you need new things to be able to do things on Zoom. And of course, the big question, like right now, people are using tools which have been built for something else. Zoom has been built for teleconferencing. It has not been built for theater pieces. And so the question is going to be like, will they develop a platform or technological software, hardware, whatever, that would be specifically made for that kind of transmedia work. And, Robert Pratten is doing some of that with his Conductor project. And then there are a couple people that sort of try to figure this out. But but there isn't yet, there is a spiderweb project out of Canada, and kind of trying to do virtual rehearsals and virtual stagings, and those kind of experiments have been there with Second Life Theater and all of those things.
Yeah, and I know a composer at Stanford who literally had to write some code to accommodate the time delay.
Yeah.
It's fine to have separated musicians, but the time delay of signal and internet strength and all that, I mean, that is a significant problem, right? Significant technical problem.
Well, I mean, most of the synchronous performances, I mean, it's been mostly addressed. It just depends on what kind of internet connection and what kind of peer-to-peer connection you have. People have been kind of playing those synchronous symphonies and all of that for last. It's been pretty well done. But anything more advanced than that, it's still sort of work in progress. So many.
You and other members of the audience feel that, I mean, in other words, there's the gimmicky side of this, and that's going to fade very quickly. And then there's the transformational side of this. What do we want of the virtual, right? The fact that you need to be tethered is very significant in, it's one thing to be sitting in a theater seat. It's another thing to be confined with it in a headset that has cords going to something or batteries that run out, right? I mean, these are real challenges, and the efforts in the art world to embrace the look of virtuality or the look of AI, are really gimmicky, and they're getting old super fast. Like they're not gonna last beyond next month.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of this stuff is kind of, oh, cool, we can do it. Yeah, I call it like Mama got a camera for Christmas. Yeah, remember when 1990s, everybody got camera on Christmas, and then there was theater shows with cameras on stage, all over the place, for no apparent good reason. So a lot of it, is dead, but there is quite a few experiments that people are doing using VR, headsets and all of that in real life, and combining it with some kind of tangible in-person experience. And there is a group in Poland that I really like that sort of tries to create VR experience, which would, illustrate some kind of philosophical concept. So, for example, Plato's, Platon, the kind of a Platonic existence without a body. How do you simulate that in order to illustrate Plato's concept of mimetic, Platonic reality, and those kind of things which try to unite the form and content, and project some form of new experience which would expand our understanding of abstract notions. And those are interesting, and I think they have a potential to go further, than just gimmick. But there aren't that many successful ones. There's a lot of problems that are embodied in that, in the unification of virtual and the real, real reality. And so, we'll see how it's gonna go.
Well, can we ask for some questions from this?
Yes, sorry, I kind of went, trying to give you the theater.
That's okay. That's great.
Yes, anybody have any questions?
People on this very small and select group has some amazing people. So maybe they'll ask some questions.
Anybody has any questions, please type it in the Q&A or in the chat. Let me see.
I think I saw someone raise their hand. That was exciting. Is that allowed? Can people raise their hand?
Yeah, people can raise their hand, but people can also type their questions in the Q&A or in the chat if they wanted to. So we don't have anybody asking any questions right now, but I do.
Can I ask a question of Gloria if she's actually listening?
Oh yeah, Gloria is here. Gloria, do you want to ask questions of Gloria?
I do. Gloria, can you update us on your immersion project? Or are you just, maybe she's just making dinner in the background?
Um,
Are you there?
yes, hi.
Hi.
Thanks, Carolyn. I know it's very loud where I am. So, but no, I put a question in the chat. Number one, thank you for doing the heavy lifting here that many of our colleagues have avoided. You are taking up that early history and you're looking at kind of suturing those ideas between something that was bifurcated between a commercial and entertainment system and a kind of critical praxis. And I think the work that you're doing now is extremely important to remind us all about the imbrication of both of those systems. They're not completely bifurcated. So that early history that you traced, I thought was extraordinarily important. And also to kind of think about the ways in which we're all institutionally situated, right? So, but in terms of going back, I thought one of the big questions I was interested in was the way in which you parse these early quote unquote metaphors, right? And thinking about the push and pull of the way in which you identified really clearly early gender dynamics that continue to be reified in, you know, from the 60s that you traced up into the contemporary times about the idea of the unknown being gendered as female and, you know,
Yeah. I'm going to just send that back to the source, who's Andreas Hewson, right? Who schooled me in that when postmodernism was rearing its tousled little head. You know, he was reminding us that that new technologies are often feminized because they're fearsome, they're potentially powerful and untrammeled. You know, I love that somebody's doing Plato's No Body. I want somebody to do Luce Irigaray's, you know, womb. You know, her answer to Plato is like, what's wrong with the cave, you fucker? Anyway, so I think gender, I mean, I just want us to all track that. I think it's going to be fascinating. You know, why would these graphic designers, maybe it's all the same graphic designer, but why would the metaverse always be a female in a headset? I'm tempted to think all the way back to Picabia, right? Who took up Paul Haviland's metaphor and said the camera is the daughter born without a mother, right? The camera is my gender baby, right? Who is the daughter born without a mother who does what I say. I mean, all of that, right? If it's feminized, we can control it.
Mm-hmm.
Case in point, Georgia, Texas, right? So I think we want to track that. And I just hope there are lots of, you know, female coders out there as great as Rachel Rawson who, you know, will problematize that construction, right? I mean, even Ian Chang, right? He's got an actual daughter and he makes a fable about a father implanting an AI in his daughter. I mean, that goes back to Hadali in The Future Eve, who is Edison's, you know, this is V.A. Dadam's fantasy of Edison creating the perfect female companion who he programs with golden records so that she constantly philosophizes to him, right? I mean, these are ancient tropes, and the fact that we're seeing them around the metaverse is like totally predictable maybe, but also sort of a great topic for us to think about. So thank you, Gloria.
No, and I would just
didn't get to hear about your project on immersion, but we'll have coffee and you'll tell me.
Yeah, but I would just say quickly, one of the other things I thought was really helpful was to kind of differentiate between, like you said, the writerly, the readerly, and the spatial. And the other question I have, and this is what occupies my work about the critique of the immersive, is the way in which the idea of a kind of a supposed subject of the immersive is somehow always stable, known, you know, and this idea of it being not embodied. And so that's where the crux comes in for me, this disembodied, or
Right.
you know, the sense of a disembodied kind of sense of subjectivity that's but you know, like eradicated from lived experience. And I think that's where your and my work, you know, obviously connects, and the stakes of it are quite real in that sense about, you know, bodies that are seen as, you know, perfect, healthy, whole, etc. And the stakes for, you know, thinking about those technologies of immersion, of to me, that's the real stakes in terms of that moment. But just going back to this idea of the spatialized, the other point of commonality or connection that I'm interested in is the scalar, right? This idea of somehow that images and forms are so ubiquitous, whether they're on the platform of the web, they're equally available to you in the gallery as an object or as a kind of downloadable, they're all sort of optimized for universality or so-called universality across multiple platforms. So we lose a sense of the scalar, and it's not for me a kind of Luddite idea of objectivity or the materiality or vibrant materialism and all of that, but really the sense of like going back, especially you mentioned those kinds of pedagogical models of architecture. Art history itself has been the most interesting field that's always had a kind of anxiety relationship to a virtual surrogate, right? We've learned about art from whether it's a slide, an image, a model,
right,
et cetera. So one of the things I love most and respect most about your work is you're one of the few art historians at the core of these questions, when in fact more art historians should be asking this. We are the field that's primed because we've always had this virtual relationship to the object, even in the 19th century, but our sense of study. And so there's
our field is born in that relationship. There's no
absolutely. And so
Yeah.
that's where I'm just appreciating this, not just a spatial relationship, but a scalar one is where I also think a lot of these questions lie.
Yeah, that's cool. Do we have another question? Yeah, I don't think
Well,
we do.
there was I was very interested in what you touched upon and what Gloria just touched upon, this promise of the metaverse, which the internet had the same promise of a kind of egalitarian, disembodied space, which will help all of us, liberate ourselves from the historical markings of our bodies. And there is a sort of similar promise that metaverse is offering right now. And I'm kind of, like you, I'm skeptical that this is going to be a liberatory project for, for women.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's first of all just say product.
Yeah.
Like you need product on your head. You need product with internet. You need, like there's a lot that's got to happen before you're in the metaverse as Zuckerberg imagines it. So gaming is the place it's going to happen first. So those on this dwindling event who are in the gaming world, please keep us posted, because that's where the monetary platforms, that's where the data is being harvested. That's where the monetary platforms are going to be trotted out, and that's where the metaverse wants to bloom. It wants to bloom.
I mean, I think it's already sort of being monetized in pornography. Yeah, I mean that's another kind of a big, huge driver of the technological development. Which is sort of ironic when you think about it in in kind of a gendered terms, that this is going to probably be the industry that is going to drive it. So.
Yeah, a friend was recently telling me about, I think it's Renee Girard's triangulation of desire, where the female might be in the body, but the guy wants to talk about it with his friend. The triangle of desire always includes someone outside the event, a representation, a narration, a power relation, right? So pornography makes total sense in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, yeah, I mean, I didn't think about it in terms in Girard's mimetic, desire thing, but that's, that's partially probably will be the driver of it. Yeah, that there has to be an audience to the desire, for the desire to exist in the first place. Yeah. So, and anybody else want to jump in and comment or?
Yeah, I mean, Walker, you want to say anything? Disagree? Correct my facts? My readings? Again, it's like perilous. People might just be tuning in the background while they.
There was, a lot of information, so I think that everybody's kind of processing and trying to figure out, where things fit.
Here comes something. Here's Walker.
Yeah, here's what. Okay, hold on. Let me just read the question. In the spirit of fungibility of time and space, You've discussed the gradual move among transmedia adjacent makers towards a fully inhabitable spatialized imaginary. Can you discuss how duration and time as something to be captured, molded, might be implicated in this history? So the relationship between time and space and the duration. Yeah.
I mean, Walker, it's such a great question. I'm struck by the fact that my collaboration with Chade, you know, he's obsessed with getting space out of this time-based medium. And I don't know, I don't know what's going to happen to duration. I mean, that's really your question, and I don't know what's going to happen. I think in the latent archive, the cost, once you've spatialized, the data processing computational cost of moving through time, right, with Manhattan as the steamboat goes by and the bridge, right, and the clouds, right, I think it's going to be very computationally intense. And I think the temptation will be to sit with space and what that will do to the experience of duration and time in these media is a super interesting question. We know that space-time is, you know, united in a kind of quantum sense. So maybe having this fungibility will liberate new forms of philosophy and concepts, and yeah, who knows? Who knows? We've been with durationality for a long time. Maybe we'll get with the octopus aliens of that wonderful film, and you know, learn that time is just loops back on itself, and we're in that. So anyway, it's a great question.
Most performing arts is durational. Yeah, I mean, there is a clear relationship between space and time, and you know, how do you measure it, or how do you coordinate it and synchronize it, and like whether this concept can be translated into yeah, that's gonna be a tricky,
it's gonna be interesting
to think through, and to particularly if you want to coordinate it across multiple.
And Walker is a historian of sound art. So, you know, similar questions for you, Walker, in your, you know, as you get your dissertation out there are, you know, what happens when the spatialized qualities of sound are privileged aesthetically over the durational, you know, form of music, right? I mean, so this is definitely, you can take these questions into other domains of art history, which are really, really interesting.
All right, anybody else want to jump in? So should we wrap it up? Caroline, anything, the last thought?
No, I'm really grateful to have the opportunity for the conversation. And yeah, I hope to hear from some of the people.
So everyone, this lecture will be posted, and I also encourage you to visit and view our other lecture and to join our conference this weekend. Already started, but there will be 5 more panels within the next 3 days. So go to the MetaLab website and go to our events, and I encourage everybody to join in. And if you are particularly interested in this conversation as it happens in theater and performance area, and how people are trying to think through very similar questions in both theoretical and practical, this would be the conference to participate. So I encourage you all. And I want to thank Caroline so much for offering us, this version and this approach, this disciplinary approach to add to the conversation among many different seminars that we had from different people approaching the subject from different fields, different disciplines, and different approaches. We are very grateful, and of course, for the wonderful background and history of the concept as well. And again, a big thanks to MetaLab and to Mahindra for hosting us for this last seminar. And thank you everyone for participating as well. And I'm gonna stop